Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mental Architecture Building the Mind One Moment at a Time, based off of my book by the same name, which is available for sale on Amazon. Today, we're going to talk about the role of imagination in time perception, but that title may be just a little bit misleading because there actually hasn't been a lot of research done on how one's imagination influences their perception of time. But into the imagination itself, there's some really interesting facts that I'd like to share with you, and then you can sort of piece those together and think about how that might influence the way people perceive time and also the way people perceive things around them. So we think of imagination as something maybe a little bit separate, where almost like dreaming, stuff that doesn't actually exist in front of you. But I'm here to challenge that notion a little bit and show you that imagination actually plays a very large role in experiencing the reality around you. And let's get started. So I wanted to begin with a quote directly from my book that I wrote, but this is from the opening paragraph of this chapter just to show you kind of where I was coming from with studying the imagination. The ability to produce, process, and manipulate mental imagery is an essential part of reflecting on past experiences or planning for the future. Balancing out the contents of your imagination within the complicated framework of conscious perception can help you with effective decision-making, task planning, and engaging in creative endeavors. Mental imagery is quite capable of simulating the physical world, in that scientists can analyze and decode activity in the visual cortex to accurately discern the contents of visual perception, visual imagery, and dreams. So to better understand how the imagination works, this group of researchers recruited about 15 subjects to participate in an experiment. And so they developed about 100 abstract geometric figures that were either arranged into a pre-constructed figure that the participants were asked to remember, or they were given a set of these figures in random arrangements and asked to mentally construct or deconstruct them. Mental maintenance was the term used to describe the memorization of a set of figures in a certain configuration, whereas mental manipulation was used for when subjects were asked to take a small set of like 4 geometric figures and then mentally rearrange them or deconstruct them. The research used a functional magnetic resonance imaging or fMRI scanner to analyze the brains of the subjects while they were engaged in these imaginary manipulation tasks or maintenance tasks. And they found that 2 regions of the brain out of 11 acted very differently during the mental manipulation tasks, and that was the frontal lobe and the medial temporal lobe. So what this research showed is that there's a distributed neural network in our brains that help piece together and deconstruct imagery so that we can take that information and then apply it to the real world. So you could think about building a house, for instance, starting out with the framing. A construction worker very likely has to imagine where all the pieces of wood and bolts and everything else are going to go, forms a mental map of that before he or she actually goes out there and starts to build the house. So everything that gets put together, everything that you build, that you construct, starts out in your imagination. One of the most mysterious conditions is where somebody can't imagine things at all. And so a researcher by the name of Adam Zaman coined the term aphantasia to describe people who are not able to imagine things in their mind. And so he's come across many different cases of this, from people who said that they just didn't understand why everybody would talk about daydreaming and imagining things because they've never been able to do that, or why people who get older and they maybe had a stroke or something like that, they lose their ability to imagine things. Aphantasia can affect anybody, and it's really interesting to see that some of the most successful artists have had this condition. Blake Ross, the co-founder of Mozilla, said the following about his aphantasia. I have never visualized anything in my entire life. I can't see my father's face or a bouncing blue ball, my childhood bedroom, or the run I went on 10 minutes ago. I thought counting sheep was a metaphor. I'm 30 years old and I never knew a human could do any of this, and it's blowing my goddamn mind. On the other end of the spectrum, you have hyperphantasia, which is characterized by the overabundance of mental imagery to the point where you can't even turn it off. And Lauren Beard, who's a children's book illustrator, very well-known book illustrator, claims to have this condition. So where visual imagery is just so overpronounced that you literally see it all the time. Now, there is currently no clinical test or neurological test for aphantasia or hyperphantasia, But if we go back in the literature, we can see that people even in the 19th century claimed to suffer from visual imagery deficits. And it's strongly suspected that the cases that came on with sudden onset may be largely psychogenic in nature. So one example is Monsieur X, who presented himself with a sudden loss of visual imagery symptoms. And although there was no post-mortem analysis done or anything like that, it was strongly believed by people that he must have suffered from some kind of anxiety or depressive disorder that led him to not being able to see things in his imagination. This is not to say that there's not a genetic component to it and that there's not something physiological going on, just that the origin of it is thought to likely be psychogenic in many cases. Something that's been very closely associated with the perceived loss of visual imagery is something known as the Cotard delusion. Now, what the Cotard delusion is, which is named after the 19th century neurologist, is basically where a person believes that they do not exist. They think that they're literally the walking dead and that they're living in some kind of shadow world. Monsieur X was one of the people who believed that, and there's been several people after that who've also experienced these symptoms along with some severe depression or anxiety that couples up with the inability to imagine things. So like I said earlier, there's a lot of research still to be done on aphantasia. There's even less research that's been done on hyperphantasia because it tends to produce positive symptoms. But I'm not sure that everybody would welcome having an overload of visual imagery in their lives either, unless it's working out for them in their career or some other way. It could be quite intrusive in some ways. But no, there's been no studies done on how your ability to perceive visual imagery and the kind of imagination that you have influences your perception of time. I looked through the literature, I couldn't find anything. So that's something that I'm very curious about personally, which is if you kind of go back to earlier videos, one of the things I talked about is that if you stare at a clock and you literally look at the clock and watch the time pass, time appears to pass very slowly due to your saccadic eye movements. But if you're just kind of sitting off and staring into space, you're kind of lapsing in and out of focus. I am certain that affects your time perception. That how you say, wow, I didn't realize that 10 minutes had just passed by. So I would be interested to look at some studies that talk about that sort of thing. So thanks for joining me this week for another episode of Mental Architecture. Next week, I'll be back to wrap up Chapter 2, where we're going to talk about whether or not consciousness and time perception are in fact one and the same thing. So be sure to come back and check that out. Don't forget to like and subscribe down below and comment if you have anything that you'd like to ask me or suggest. I wish everybody a great day. Take care.